Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the privilege of that's the first ovation, semi-ovation I've gotten. So I have the privilege of serving as the Jonathan Fanton Director of Roosevelt House. I want to welcome you to the House and to remind you that before we get to the formal introductions, that we will be having a conversation tonight with Nancy Eisenberg and my old pal Frank Rich, facilitated by Roosevelt House's own Bill Goldstein, to discuss Nancy's book, White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America. And cognizant of the fact that we meet in the House where FDR planned the social safety net that perhaps did more to rectify class inequality than any other program in American history. We remember, by the way, interestingly, that Roosevelt was labeled a traitor to his class for doing that. To make tonight's formal introduction, I'm so pleased to welcome someone very special in her own right, an extraordinary human rights activist, attorney, expert on human rights, and an inspiring leader to all of us at Roosevelt House, because she is our beloved chair of the Board of Advisors. Please welcome Rita Hauser.
Thank you, one and all, and to everybody upstairs, standing room. I knew this would be a hit as soon as I saw it. So I'm very glad, because it is a subject of tremendous relevance. And at Roosevelt House, we have had really the most extraordinary series of books and speakers, and I think we're packed here every night. So it is really a great achievement for everyone, and I'm thrilled with the subject and the people. You know the book, you know the subject. I'll just be very brief in saying we have Nancy Eisenberg, who is the Williams Professor of History at Louisiana State University, and she has written a number of books, and some of them she has co-authored with her husband, who is here with us, particularly Madison and Jefferson, which they wrote together, and I think that's a wonderful accomplishment. She's writing another book, and she's been on C-SPAN and TV and all of that, regular contributor, and this particular subject was obviously one we all talked about then, during, now, and forever on what is called white trash or hillbillies. Frank, I've known such a long time, and I can say frankly, everybody bought the Sunday Times when you were writing your column. He is a writer at large now for New Yorker magazine, and he joined them after having left a nice long career, culture, op-ed, theater reviews. I even learned tonight he was a TV reviewer at the New York Times and elsewhere. He's written every place and everywhere on theater, on culture, and on the decline and fall of truth from 9/11 to Katrina. He's a creative consultant to HBO, where he's executive director of an Emmy-winning comedy, Veep, which I think a lot of you must have seen, and others such. And he has got a forthcoming documentary called Becoming Mike Nichols, which I'm looking forward to as well. So let's get on with the conversation, and then there's time for plenty of questions.
Well, thank you both for being here. Nancy, we have 400 years to get through, so we should begin quickly. What I'm struck by in your book is, first of all, the title, but then the way in which, in surveying American history, you really seize, as you do in the title, on language and how language has reflects our history, but also has shaped it. So just to get us started, could you tell us about the title and how you chose such a perfect title, and whether there was any debate in your publishing house whether this would be the title?
There was.
Okay.
One of the things I wanted to do with this book is show that our notions of class have a much longer and older history. And I take it all the way back to the British colonial period, in part because even though we tell ourselves that the American Revolution, we left Great Britain, we got rid of the aristocracy. In fact, none of that is true. We borrowed a great deal from British and English culture. And two of the concepts that are sort of central to where white trash comes from is, first of all, since we have been an agrarian nation for over half our history, it's important to pay attention to rural ways of thinking about class. And the idea of white trash actually was first used by Richard Hakluyt, who was an Elizabethan adventurer who made a pitch to Queen Elizabeth about why we needed the New World. And the real reason that he felt the New World was important is that it was going to be the trash bin for the poor and the idle and the worthless people in England. Now, this, of course, upsets the apple cart on the idea that somehow everyone who came to the New World were seeking religious liberty. It's not true. Most people were coming for economic reasons, and the word that was used by Richard Hakluyt to describe these people was waste people. So therefore, the idea of trash, Thomas Jefferson, Abigail Adams referred to the rural white population as rubbish. Now, we still hear that. British people still use that term today. But part of what I was trying to uncover is that two big concepts that we need to think about still shape our class system today. One is the idea of land and the importance of the civic value and the economic value and the class value of being a landowner. And this is important because one of the things that we have to realize is that even in the early founding period, you couldn't vote unless you owned land. And land, in a sense, was seen as the real source of liberty. You had to be a landowner. So land, and if we think about why land continued to be associated with the poor were very much fashioned as either being seen as people who lived on land that was considered wasteland, because that's where waste people came from. Wasteland is land that's left untilled and fallow and is unproductive. So therefore, the waste people throughout American history end up being associated with unproductive land. For example, the term redneck is identified as being associated with people who live in swamps. At the same time, hillbillies are associated with people who live in the hills and are seen as poor. So land that's unproductive is the source of one important definition for understanding class identity. The other important theme that I highlight, which we also inherited from the British, is the idea of breeding. And this is really important because this is the idea that one's class identity is passed from one generation to the next. This connects to pedigree, lineage, and the fact that for the British and for early Americans and Americans in general, one of the things that we don't pay attention to is that class is not just only about property ownership or the labor value of the job you have. It's also very much linked to breeding and even your children. Children were a measure of the class identity and class status of individuals because the poor children were always seen as unhealthy, poorly clothed, poorly fed. And by the time the term white trash appears, which is in the 1820s, at that moment, poor whites and white trash are now being associated with two other rather disturbing terms for the poor, which were clay eaters and sandhillers. Sandhillers, again, they lived on worthless sand. Clay eaters is where they were seen as not even being white. They were seen as having the skin color, a yellowish tint to their skin color that was compared to parchment. And part of the reason they had this disease is it's pellagra, but in the 1820s, 1840s, no one identified this. This doesn't get identified until the early 20th century. So when we think about class, we have to return to the importance of breeding, inheritance, and this is also why, as I trace my history, the other important thing to think about, and this unfortunately is still part of our history today, the other group that the English despised were vagrants. So the poor, in a sense, are always associated with people who don't put down roots, who aren't property owners, who are seen as people who are always on the move, people who, and this is actually even used today as a rationale for dealing with the poor. You might all be familiar with Kevin Williamson. He wrote for the National Review. When he wrote a very hostile essay attacking Trump supporters, he not only attacked them for living in dying dying cities and towns. And also used another favorite trope, referred to their critique as a yelping dog. But then he went on to say that, well, if you're poor, all you have to do is pack your bags and move. And this is, this idea of mobility continues to be a part of white trash identity, because in the late 19th century, there were cracker carts, because cracker is another important term for poor whites. And if we think about trailer trash, that's a house on wheels. That's a home, that's a place you live that never gets the same, it's never really seen as a home, because it's seen as again, people who are on the move, people who are not real property owners. So if you can go away from tonight thinking about several things that continue to be a part of our class identity. One is the way it's passed from parent to child, and that's even true for sociologists. They have found in 2015 the most important predictor of being successful in this country is linked to the wealth and privilege that you get from not only your parents, but your ancestors. So lineage and this idea of inheritance is still very much a part of our class definition. The other is this idea of breeding. Breeding is not only the way we might think of it in a positive term, as acquiring taste or skills. It also, for white trash, it was seen as an imposed identity, something you literally inherited, and that's why I have a great deal to say about the eugenics movement and how incredibly popular that was. Everyone subscribed to this ideology. Professors at Harvard, leading politicians like Teddy Roosevelt. As you know, the major institute for studying eugenics was in New York, was in Long Island. Charles Davenport was the head of that. So these three concepts, mobility, vagrancy, breeding, pedigree, land and property, I think still continue to be extremely important ways for how we sort and divide people, because class isn't just about the money you earn, it isn't just about your job and the status. It's also bodily. It's also seen as the way you appear, and that's why white trash were always seen as, children who are barefoot, diseased, and that this is sort of the dark side of class that really did define this cultural pattern that gets reinvented as the terms get reinvented across history and time.
Well, so I'll come back to the fight you had with your publisher, you had with your publisher about the title. But Frank, I wanted to ask you to speak to this issue about mobility, the idea really that we have of America as a place of liberty and mobility. I mean, what Nancy is saying is that the mobility is actually in many ways an illusion, and white trash is a term that coheres around mobility or lack thereof. So if you could speak about the illusions that we live under, really, in terms of the American dream itself, the idea of the American dream.
Right. Well, I think, in this terrific book, I have to say, those who haven't read it should read it, because this is a part of history we were talking before coming on that just has been, it's one of several things in American history that have been neglected. I mean, we know certain stories have been neglected, minority group stories until recently and so on. But this cuts right across from the earliest settlements to the present day, and also another thing in the book that's fascinating is how it's also rooted in pop culture throughout. The Tobacco Road to the Beverly Hillbillies and everything in between. Yes, of course, this idea of complete freedom is an illusion, and it's something that politicians in particular like to sell. And, really probably it's Janis Joplin who had it right. I mean, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. But still, it was Chris Christopherson, that's right,
Yeah.
Chris Christopherson wrote it, right? She sang it,
She sang it.
but he wrote it. And so a lot of this is completely, rooted in our creation as a country and remains that way. And indeed, the Kevin Williamson piece is one of several pieces by conservatives, including, I would argue, Hillbilly Elegy, that memoir, Charles Murray, the conservative scholar. They all basically say, why can't you be like me and get up and go?
Right.
And Williamson, rent a U-Haul and just leave,
Right.
And And so so even people who are politically sympathetic in a way to how current lower class or working class whites vote still think, what's wrong with you? Freedom is there, it's there to be taken, and it has nothing to do, there's nothing stopping you, not the issues of pedigree and all the issues you discuss in this book that have been there from the beginning. It's just everyone has this opportunity. And then, of course, the political, this is beyond the purview of what we're discussing about, but then, of course, somewhat ironically, I guess, a lot of people who are stuck in these, in this economic plight and don't have the freedom of complete mobility, then assume that immigrants are somehow getting everything they're not. By the way, and another theme that's in the book that I'd like to hear you talk more about, Nancy, is you know that also people who do escape it historically then shut the door on those behind them and just assume, why can't it, and this goes back to a whole generation that was helped by the New Deal, helped during the Depression, as you describe, and then turn against the safety net and shut the door to that freedom.
Yeah, two things. I mean, if we think for example, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, you've all heard of them. Their argument was not actually about promising mobility up the class ladder. What they claimed was going to change the class structure was the size of the continent. And what they promised was horizontal mobility, not upward mobility. But even Franklin, in a sense, was kind of as harsh as Kevin Williamson. Basically, he believed that if the poor were drawn into the West, that the ones who would succeed, who worked hard, had large families, that they, in a sense, would not only succeed, but that if they didn't succeed, he basically said, well, your option was to move on or die. And that's the thing I always like to remind people how the British thought about the poor. The British said that in the colonial period, there were 4 options about what would happen to the poor. First of all, they would die from starvation or disease. Second of all, they would be arrested and end up dying on the gallows or be executed. Third of all, they'd be sent off to fight wars and die there. And then fourth of all, they were going to be sent to the New World, and it was also expected that they would die there. And most of the early indentured servants who were sent to the New World were children, which is another thing I like to highlight. We forget that we had child labor into this country until 1919. And this was true across the board. This was in the South and in the North about exploiting child labor. And that also is why indentured servants, because of breeding, influenced the introduction of slavery into the New World. So those two things are intimately interconnected. But what Rich was saying, and one other thing about to prove how mobility really didn't happen. In 1776, in Thomas Jefferson's Virginia, 40% of the white male tenant farmers, landless, they didn't own slaves, they didn't own land, 40% of the population, 1930s, 40% of the population is still landless tenant farmers, 2/3 are white and 2/3 are in the South. And that's one of the things I always like to remind people. When we think of social mobility, that comes with a commercial society, not an agrarian society. And in fact, at the time of the Revolution, there was more upward mobility in Great Britain than there was in the New World, because we were more agrarian-based. But what Frank was talking about is this idea of upscale rednecks. And this is kind of, I think, one of the interesting issues about class identity in the United States. One of the things I talk about when we think about the 1950s, 1960s, and even into the 70s, part of class identity is that you want to blend in. And this is particularly true if we think about the 50s, that you were supposed to, move to the suburbs, you were supposed to somehow become an American by, a new geography, a new place that you lived. And there was this compelling need to, and this affect ethnic identity, to, learn to speak in a proper way, learn to assimilate. And the same is actually true, which is strange, but the same is actually true for how white trash imagine themselves, that they also did not want any connection to their past, that they also did not want to even acknowledge, or even, you'd think they would be the ones with, wanting to provide charity, wanting to sort of help raise up people in a similar situation. But no, because there's almost a penalty by associating what your roots are, where you come from. And I think this is still true today because we still measure people by where they're born, by all the things that we associate with success in this country. So hiding your past as well as cutting off your past, I think, is one of the things that we often don't think about. We don't realize that just because you move into the middle class, that somehow you are the one who is going to be more generous to other people who are left behind. And that's one of the things I like to highlight. This is, I think, part of the problem with the Democratic Party. We can't just talk about saving the middle class. We have to realize if there's a middle class, there's also a lower class. And today, 42% of people living below the poverty line are white. So we can't just talk about the middle class. We have to sort of realize, and there's even, one of the things I talk about, there's even class tension between people who imagine themselves as white trash versus rednecks, or the term that is used by the sociologist Joan Williams is the idea of where she refers to the settled working class and then the hard living underclass. And I think that's really because there's a real tension there because even though the settled working class are really afraid that they're going to drop down, they don't have any sense of class security. So they want to distinguish themselves. So we kind of think, oh, it's just upper, middle, and lower class. Not true. And even in the 19th century, one of the leading Confederates and intellectuals of Southern class system had 6 different classes for how he described white people in the South. And this is the other thing I think we have to pay attention to. Stop sort of assuming that, there's just 3 classes and that somehow all we have to worry about is the middle class.
Well, and that there's fluidity among them. I mean, that you can rise from one to the other. But I think one of the things I'd like to talk about in terms of the last presidential election, I mean, is one, your book was published in the middle of the primary season, which was uncanny timing, perfect academic timing, no doubt planned many years in advance. But how do you see, and then Frank, how do you see some of these issues playing out in what for many was a surprising outcome? Because one of the questions I had as you're talking is that a kind of an embrace of self-reliance that you talk about seems to go against what others, I mean, and including some of the people that you're talking about, would define as their own self-interest. So why is there a kind of, hunkering down almost into, into either policies that have not succeeded in raising the lower class to the middle class or the middle class to the upper class? And then what is the effect of that embrace on our country today? I mean, under a Trump presidency, I hate to use that phrase. Yeah.
Well, I think, one of the things that came out in the campaign season, and this is again based on observations of sociologists and others, is there is a real tension when we think about, I mean, one of the critiques I have is we can't just talk about the working class as a single unified class either. And the election really played off a whole series of things that were seen as opposites and as being contested. And that is the idea that we have an urban and rural divide. We have the language of cosmopolitan versus provincial. We have the idea of privileged elites versus how many people who imagine themselves as both upscale rednecks and white trash who would see themselves as the disinherited. And that to me was a very revealing concept because that again got me back to the idea of land. And it also gets into why there's so much resentment against immigrants, against groups that they see who are somehow being given handouts or privileges from the federal government that somehow is taking away from them. And they see that the latter has been rigged and that somehow they can't compete because the government is somehow favoring these groups. But this is part of the problem of our history. We never seem to acknowledge that the government has helped all sorts of people. I always, go back to World War II and the GI Bill, which my father benefited from, and no one sort of saw that as necessarily an undeserving welfare. And even today, what is so interesting about working class and poor rural Americans is that they prefer to get disability than welfare. Because disability, and these people have serious injuries because they're doing really demanding, difficult, and physically, the kinds of jobs that do lead to serious physical problems. But there's the question of honor and reputation, and this problem of where do we get our identity from? If you imagine that your identity comes, as many poor rural Americans, it comes from your family, it comes from your community, you're not just going to pack your bags and move, because that's kind of been the source of who you are. So the idea that individualism, that every individual should just go off and make a living, doesn't take into account the way in which people in rural America actually live and what they value. And I think that's one of the things we have to think about, because I think that one of the things that the election raised is this: we have to have a debate in this country, and we're already having a debate about the relationship between how we measure what work means and civic virtue, and how those two things are connected.
Well, Frank, I mean, if you could take that idea and then connect it to a couple of issues that are of major concern now. I mean, one is healthcare. Why is you raised the question of disability as opposed to welfare, but why is healthcare in general not seen, this is too large a question, I don't mean why is it not seen as a right, but why is there not a connection between the honor of receiving a disability check as opposed to a welfare check connected to an idea that healthcare is a social welfare open to all of us, I mean, whether we're working or unemployed or poor or starving or rich. And how does that play out in the election?
Well, it's very complicated because you have to inject into it to understand that the politics, the amount of political propaganda that's out there. In the early days of the Tea Party movement, when people had placards saying, take government hands off my Medicare, shows there's a confusion about what's going on. One of the most interesting things in the Vance book is
This is Hillbilly Elegy.
Hillbilly Elegy. All right, so here's a guy who's very, very successful. He's now venture capitalist in Silicon Valley with Peter Thiel. He concedes, to his credit, candidly in the book, that he's a huge beneficiary of government aid. Pell Grants. He was in the Marines. He got a scholarship at State University in Ohio. He GI Bill, went to Yale. All of this, and yet cannot bring himself to say that the government should do any of this for the people he left behind in Ohio. And in fact, after the book became a bestseller, he announced he was going to go back to Ohio.
Running for office, I think.
I think it's eventually he's going to run for office as a Republican.
Right.
And what is he doing there? He's basically going to look for hedge fund investments there to maybe, kind of Trump sort of will help get 15 people jobs, So this whole split, and this is something we haven't talked about yet, race has a lot to do with it too, as well as immigrants, because this feeling that somehow other people who are getting government aid are the real trash, the real undeserving, the moochers, even as they're dependent on the government for things, including health care. And of course, what's happening now is that Obamacare, whatever its flaws, did give a lot of people health care. And now, if it's taken away, which seems likely, or it collapses because of the sabotage being done on what exists by the Trump administration, they're definitely going to want it. So once they have it, they want it. People do like Medicare. They do like Medicaid. In some of the most blighted parts of the Rust Belt, where the drug epidemic is out of control, they benefited under Obamacare. That for the first time, drug clinics were opened up, and addiction treatment was started, in parts of Ohio and Pennsylvania, and so once they need it, they like it, and now we'll see what, it'll be interesting, the politics will be interesting to see if it's taken away. And these are mainly people who voted for Trump to the extent that they voted. So, it's all, so I think race has a lot to do with it too. One of the interesting things about Vance's book, about Hillbilly Elegy, but also about the sociologist Arlie Hochschild did this book about Louisiana, Strangers in Their Own Land, where she spent 4 years basically with people around Baton Rouge who are lower class, white, vote against their own interests, vote for Bobby Jindal, who did everything he could to, pollute the state and literally poison their own water and their own environment. She makes the point from the left, she's a liberal, and Vance makes the point from the right, none of these people are racist. So it has to be something else. Race has nothing to do with it. And it's a strain through your book historically. I think it's bogus in the present, but you can talk about it more in historically where that fits in.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that, again, going back into the past and talking about history, one of the things that we don't forget, we tend to forget, is that during the Civil War, there was class and race were a dominant part of the divisions between the North and the South. And in Reconstruction, for example, one of the things that happened is that Republicans and people in the Freedmen's Bureau, and what people often don't know, the Freedmen's Bureau was also provided aid for white refugees. So in certain areas like Tennessee, Missouri, poor whites received extensive aid from the federal government. But what we forget is that from the Republican point of view in Reconstruction, over and over again, every major journalist, and this is what's amazing, they all wrote articles in major newspapers, they all wrote books about how are we going to reconstruct the South. And one of their key arguments that they felt would be a measure of whether the South will be able to rebuild itself in the image of the North and establish a free labor, freedom of contract society, is they really believed that it was going to be a contest between the freed slave and poor whites about who was actually going to get an education, get a job, be able to support themselves. And what we don't realize is that many of these Northerners and Republicans felt that African Americans were making progress at a much faster rate and were being far more successful. And then if you look at of course, the hostile reaction and the way in which the Democratic Party at that time used race quite effectively to attack the Republican Party. And when they went after the Republican Party and they looked at the politics in Reconstruction, they targeted 3 groups. And they used, and this is again, very specifically language that is disturbing to our ears, but the one we all know about are the carpetbaggers, because they were the people who came from the North and somehow were going to take over the South. 2 other groups I spent a great deal of time, and that is they focused on a term that they used over and over again, and that is the idea of mongrels. So they were obsessed with the idea of racial amalgamation, and and this becomes a dominant theme that the entire nation was going to collapse because there would be too much freedom, the fear of marriage between black and whites. This was going to lead to the downfall of not only the South, but the whole society. The other term, and this is one of my, again, to get you back to the vocabulary, a term to describe poor whites who supported the Republican Party. They were called scallywags. Now, what does that term mean? I spent a lot of time trying to figure this term out and where it came from. Yes, it was a way for elite whites and people who supported the Democratic Party to attack poor whites, and they saw them as a traitor to their race. They also described them as white trash scum. They referred to them because they were seen as Republican operatives. They associated too freely with blacks. But the word scallywag actually refers to an inferior breed of animal, particularly cattle. It's called vagabond stock. So there we have our vagrant theme again. We have our pedigree theme again. And they were seen as, the worst of the worst. And one of the leading redeemers referred to them, a very famous quote that even made it all the way to England, said that they were such, an inferior breed of Southerner that they were comparable to the meat that even dogs shouldn't eat. So, you know, in fact, not only, and this, yes, I'm focusing on Southern politics, but even I have a whole section on the antebellum period where the racial issue and the pedigree issue dealt with the Mexican War, dealt with the racial, you know, the arising of biological racism and how that plays into class. So there are moments when these concepts come together, when these concepts influence each other. But I also feel, and that's why one of my arguments today is that we have to look at race and class together. We have to sort of deal with both of these issues because they're really important in the way in which they can be used. They can also be used to divide poor whites and African Americans politically. And that was what the racist demagogues of the 1890s and the early 20th century, like James Vardaman, and he's the one who I think is most like Trump, because basically he said that democracy should be as dirty as the people are, and the people should get to say whatever they want. And he was also known for his long locks. But
What color?
yes, they weren't orange. But I think this is why I say democracy, we have to sort of realize that much of what Trump is doing is borrowing from scripts from previous presidents, previous politicians, and the idea that politicians put on a show, that they entertain the audience, not just that they make empty promises, but that in Trump's case that he spoke in a way that people felt was more honest and more authentic, because even if he insulted people, somehow that's more honest than a politician who, you know, will talk around an issue. And that's something that, again, scholars who look at class politics, working class politics today say it's very appealing. This idea of straight talk, this idea that you're not going to, even though he's feeding people a lie, they weren't doing a fact check. It was the way he spoke. It's the style in which he spoke that really, in a sense, was seen as somehow he's talking to them and not down at them. And that's the way in which many Trump supporters, like the Tea Party supporters, hate privileged elites who they associate with Washington insiders.
So do you think, I mean, speaking of the mongrel, it occurred to me while you were saying this, do you think that President Obama was even more an object of vitriol because he was a biracial man than he was simply because he was a black man? I mean, a suspicion of the infiltration of white America, the weakening of white America by, you know, miscegenation.
Yeah, I mean, and that, who is it? The country singer, the one who's no, he's a hard rock country singer. The one who was just invited to the White House.
Ted Nugent?
Ted Nugent called Obama a mongrel. I mean, I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
So yes, what's dangerous, again, the danger is this instability. The fact that, and the fear of passing for white. And in the eugenics movement, at the same time the eugenics movement was widely popular in this country in the 1920s, which targeted poor white women. They were seen as the group that should be sterilized. They were the targeted group. And on top of that, they were very afraid because many poor blacks and poor whites lived in the same neighborhood. They socialized with each other. There was also a danger on top of that, you know, poor white women are going to be the group that is going to be more likely to want to engage with sex with black men. So both of those fears end up being intertwined again. And that's the other thing that my book highlights. When I talk about breeding, Thomas Jefferson not only viewed female slaves as a better investment than male slaves because of their ability to breed children that would be exploited as laborers. But we also have to remember that breeding is also about sexual reproduction. And this is another important theme of my book, since I am a women's historian, is to talk about gender, sexuality, and how that also is woven into our class identity. And that's something that we tend to also not pay attention to. Not only there are differences between how women, poor white women, I quote Dolly Parton from her memoir where she talks about the horrors of being a poor white woman. It's not only you're poor and dirty and you have to, you know, you can't even keep yourself clean, but the fact is you have, you know, if men want to put their hands all over you, they can. And that's another thing that I also trace throughout. It goes all the way back to the antebellum period. In the same way children are a measure of class status, so are the way women are treated. Because, again, to be a Southern belle meant that not only were you protected and you lived in the plantation house, but you also preserved the whiteness of your skin. And Rachel Jackson was attacked because she had tanned skin, which associated her with someone who worked outside and was seen as coming from a different class background.
So before we go to questions from the audience, I mean, tell us about the title of the book, and because
Well, as everything, titles went through various different names. I mean, one of them was going to be The American Breed, and that had the breeding theme. Another one, and it's still very important, sort of I ended up, that's in the Franklin Tom Paine chapter. Initially, I was also thinking about using waste people. And then at one point it went white trash, and we still weren't decided. And then finally, my editor, Wendy, who's right over there, said, we're going to go with white trash. So I said, okay, fine. But it is very controversial. I mean, it is, people look at the title and they sort of assume that this book is an attack on white trash as opposed to explaining the history and, in a sense, trying to open our eyes to this issue. Because, and I do highlight the fact that this term, throughout history, it had all the scandalous connotations that we associate with a slur. And that's one of the things that we need to understand about why this concept just constantly got reinvented over time.
and reinvented and actually more institutionalized. I mean, and now runs the. I mean, I'm not saying runs the country, but the idea, I mean, is actually much more active than we had thought until now.
Right.
But I thought it was fascinating what you said, and then we will go to questions about the agrarian roots of all of this and how we perhaps have been misled by the disappearance of farms to think that the ways of thinking about the American past and the American present disappearing along with it.
Right, and that's why I highlight, I mean, this urban-rural divide, that has also been a debate, which you're probably aware. I mean, Trump's campaign referred to rural voters as the hidden Trump voters. And I think there is this theme of rural Americans, and they also is divided by a myth. One is the more negative, where they've been, like H.L. Mencken attacked them for being provincials, for being yokels, another slur, for, in a sense, being people who are living in the past, living a backward existence. And that resentment clearly was fueled by the Trump campaign. The other mythology is the idea that we still subscribe to, is that somehow America and its real backbone is in small towns. I grew up on Main Street, believe it or not. I grew up on a small town on Main Street, but we mythologize that, where we still believe that somehow small town America is where true virtue is implanted, and that somehow this is the core of our identity. But many people who live in small towns today, who are suffering serious economic difficulties, realize, and they feel that the country is ignoring. It's not just the flyover area, but there are somehow people with wealth are not paying attention to rural America, to small town America. But there's still a lot of myth and ideology that's woven into these concepts. And that's the other thing my book tries to show, is always trying to sort the difference between the political rhetoric, the political cultural politics at the time, and then what were the real conditions that people were living in at that time. And that's often what, in politics, we get little of that, or less of that than I would like.
Well, on that note, thank you, Nancy. Thank you,
Thank you.
Frank. We'll go to the questions. We have a student coming with the mic.
Well, it's all quite fabulous and overdue, and thank you very much. It's a great book. I'd like to ask you if you could say a little bit more about the role of work, not just the economy, not just plenty of jobs, good jobs, as a erasure of some class differences, but the role of work and the lazy, indolent, etc. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there are several markers of class identity. One, as I said, whether you own property, the home you live in, The other is the health of your children, your corporeal identity, your dress, your appearance, your education, et cetera, which are associated with breeding. But I think when we think about work, that's why when you look at poor rural whites, not only were these people, they were dismissed as idle and unproductive, not only because they didn't own land, but they were constantly on the move, but also they were seen, if we look at squatters and crackers, they were seen as people, I thought, this is actually another really important gender concept, is that often the poor in the late 18th century into the 19th century were seen as that the men are lazy and idle and not working, and that they make women do all the work, all the farming. And that actually continues in the South into the industrial period, because all the textile mills in the South employed white women and white children. And and the men, because they thought it was beneath their dignity to do this kind of work. And it gets back to our concept of liberty. For many poor white men, it was, they would hunt, they would fish, that is what they would do, but they in a sense, were not going to, take on jobs that they associated as demeaning. And we don't think of that. We don't think of industry as demeaning, but it certainly denies you any kind of, liberty when you work in a factory. Someone's always telling you what to do. Someone's looking over your shoulder. Then we have the introduction of time clocks. This, in a sense, was something that they saw as undermining their male authority, because it was very much about male authority. But the most disturbing thing about that is that many parents felt that they owned their children's labor. So those parents had no trouble sending their children to work in coal mines, to work in factories, and doing really dangerous work at the same time.
Other questions? Oh, wait for the microphone. No.
I was working a lumpy yard over the summers and things. Most of the workers, all the workers, who were the yard men and the drivers, etc., they were Italian immigrants. Their English was not very good, were not very literate. But the fact that they were working hard and got a paycheck at the end of every month, every week, and could support their family, gave them an enormous sense of self-worth. And that is a lesson I have carried my entire life.
Yeah, I think this is something that Barbara Ehrenreich wrote about, the breadwinner, the male breadwinner, the idea that this is very much a part of class identity, that this is very much, and this in a sense we know was true for the middle class too. But I think that one of the problems, and this is an issue that labor historians have talked about and is always a problem, it's not only about labor value, how the market defines the value of your work, it's also about the way we have historically identified dignity, a certain kind of dignity that's associated with the work that you do. And this is a problem when the economy is constantly shifting, jobs that were seen as respectable are disappearing. I read an article the other day that was referring to the fact that for many, working class white men, being a policeman is seen as a very important kind of job because it's respected, you get a stable income, you get health care, and you don't need a college education to do this kind of job. And I think that's, one of the most disturbing statistics that I came across in researching the new preface in the paperback is that in America today, only 32.5% of the population have a college degree. And that's for people who are college age up to 60 years old. So I think one of the issues is that when we keep talking about meritocracy or keep talking about college education as the one ladder, we need more than one ladder to talk about making people feel that they have some kind of dignity where they work, some type of security. And this alone isn't going to erase other problems, as we know. It's not going to sort of solve the issues of racism and how they were exploited by politicians, because that legacy is going to continue to be with us. But I think we do have to think about that when we think of, as I said, not just three classes or not just the idea that there's one ladder and that's the only route to, to move up in our society is another way to to look at this problem from a different perspective.
Right. Do you see political implications to this idea of the several ladders that are necessary and
I think
solutions to that?
I think people in the political sphere, certainly in the Democratic Party, to the extent that the Democratic Party has any kind of focus or discussion, people are beginning to realize that you cannot put together a constituency or a coalition if it's just people who are being college educated to work in service professions or whatever. And since obviously industrial jobs are vanishing, there has to be something else. There are lots of theories about what it might be. Even Hillary Clinton had some programs in this regard, but it hasn't coalesced or gelled into any kind of political movement or platform or plan. It's all been sort of lost in the bigger discussion of inequality and a lot of the issues we're talking about today rather than that. But yes, that's clearly incredibly important. But there are also debates about then what is it? You know, is it job training that doesn't involve college, but does that always work? Are people always susceptible to it or inclined to do it? It's much easier to say, get into a U-Haul and
Right.
leave
Right.
town and you know be like Tom and Joe during the Dust Bowl and vanish into
No,
whatever.
and even today, I mean, you know, one of the solutions that was offered by a major politician and was the idea that working class white men should get pink collar jobs. Again, ignoring the gender dynamic in our society. As we know, we have not escaped
No.
patriarchy. I know that's not a revelation for people in this audience.
We have time for one more question.
What is your opinion on Marx's works on the class struggle and alienation, the role they play in shaping society?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite get that.
Yeah, Marx.
Well,
Oh.
Marx, what role does Marx?
Well, that's one of the things I like to point out is that these British notions, as I said, emerged long before Karl Marx, was talking about the division between, labor and management, or even the difference, if Marx and Engels, who I, studied in graduate school, if we think about the emergence of the bourgeoisie. And that's one of the things that I wanted to do in this book is that in the history profession, there's been a great deal of work that has focused on labor history, that has focused on the industrial site, has worked, the shop floor and talked about union organizing, and all of that is very important because I think this is one of the reasons we're having this economic crisis today is the fact that the Republicans have worked hard to dismantle unions in this country and dismantle them. And one of the things that I do like to mention is that William Randolph Hearst ran for president. He was far wealthier than Trump. And he, in 1904, openly endorsed unions as the best way to eliminate class divisions in society. And I think that's kind of another reminder. The way in which unions have been vilified is a really, and again, through misleading language. I mean, I lived in Iowa, when you talk about right-to-work states, and that you encourage people who are in unions because the union dues are too much to not understand that their collective bargaining power is a much stronger position than the individual being able to defend themselves when they're fighting against really powerful corporations. So what I was trying to add to that picture was to talk about recovering this rural language and this rural way of thinking about class, because that has continued, not only because portions of our society have remained rural, but it even has migrated beyond the rural environment. I mean, as with trailer trash. I have a whole discussion of how they emerge in opposition to suburbia, and where are they located? They're located off on the edges of cities, the dangerous fringe of the metropolis. And they end up, sociologists in 1970s begin to call them hillbilly havens, because they're not even buying new trailer trash, they're buying used trailers, secondhand, third-hand trailers. And this is sort of a whole world that we tend to ignore, because trailers, according to a very important New Jersey court case, state case, 1962, basically argued that municipalities can discriminate against people who live in trailers. And what it referred to them as, again, a nomadic people. So they in a sense have no rights, and they can be forced to leave a community because they're seen as we know, lowering property values.
They're seen as trash. That's
Right.
why it's the right title. I think you ended up with the right title.
Who knew America was the Fresh Kills landfill?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, thank you very much, Nancy Eisenberg. Thank you, Frank
Thank
Rich. I invite you upstairs. We'll have a reception and a book signing. Nancy
Very
Eisenberg
nice
will
to meet
sign.
Thank
your book.
you.
I'll see you again.
Yes,
Congratulations.
thank you.